Welcome everybody to the SiteZeus webinar series, How to Leverage Social Media Segments for Rapid Customer Insights. This is your host, Tyler Carlson. So excited to kick off the new year with today's webinar. Couple quick housekeeping items before we get started. As always, we love feedback here at SiteZeus. So if you like what you're hearing, please let us know in the chat box, or if you have any questions, put it in the chat box for us. And at the end of the presentation, we'll have a short question and answer session to address some of the questions that were surfaced during the webinar. Also, make sure to stay tuned all the way through the webinar as we have a special bonus for you at the end. Did you know that over 74% of North America is currently using social media? There was recently a study that showed that baby boomers are actually spending more time online than they are watching TV. The adaptation of technology and social media is compounding. Globally, there's been a 13% increase in social media adaptation in just 1 year. Now, every 11 seconds, someone signs up to use social media for their very first time. So excited for today's webinar, and you're probably wondering what's in it for you. So on today's webinar, we're gonna learn about what is spatial AI and SiteZeus. Number two, what is the data landscape today, and how is this geospatial data different than the historical psychographic profiles? We'll also look at what drives your existing stores. You may have two stores that look similar on paper, but perform drastically different, and this data can help answer why. We'll also get into the increased model accuracy, as well as the benefits to your marketing team. Make sure to stay for the end of the webinar to learn how you can see your concept with spatial and SiteZeus. It is my pleasure to introduce Leiden Faust, co-founder and CEO of Spatial AI, the world's first human-driven layer for cities. Before Spatial, Leiden was an ethnographic research consultant for brands like Procter & Gamble. He then launched Spatial AI in 2016 as a Techstar class winner. In the 8th grade, he also pitched a no-hitter. Keenan Baldwin co-founded SiteZeus with his brother after having a front row seat to the challenges many of you on the call face as he grew a franchise in the Southeast and what sparked to the SiteZeus light bulb moment. Please help me wish him a huge congratulations as he has T-minus 73 days until he gets married. Without further ado, I'll pass the mic to the man himself, Keenan Baldwin.
Tyler, really appreciate the introduction there and the footnote about getting married here in T-minus 73 days. Outside of that, I think this announcement about the partnership with Spatial AI, I just could not be more excited about this in a way to kick off 2019. So for those of you on the webinar today that are not familiar with SiteZeus, a little bit about what we are, who we are, and what we do. So we're a technology company that's leading a paradigm shift for retailers and restaurants to build and deploy predictive analytics in real time using artificial intelligence for site selection, market planning, and portfolio optimization. So how does that work? So first, we take your data, so your store level proprietary data, whether that's revenue, membership count, patient count, so we're agnostic from that standpoint, as well as what we call site characteristics or site attributes. So things like square footage, parking spaces, does it have a drive-through, how many operating rooms do you have, etc. We then take that data and we combine it with what we call our Olympus Data Exchange. And in our exchange, we have a number of different data providers and data sets ranging from massive mobile data, traffic volume, competitive indexes, household demographics, but most importantly, and the focus of today's conversation and the partnership that we announced recently is with Spatial AI and the GeoSocial data that Leiden is going to momentarily educate us all on what that data is and how it can impact us. So once your data is combined with the data exchange and all of those data sets that we offer, it then runs through our proprietary artificial intelligence engine. The output of that allows you as an end user or retailer to leverage our platform to look at infill opportunity, greenfield or white space analysis, relocation strategies, remodel opportunities, and closure analysis. And so without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and pass the mic over to Leiden, who's going to walk us through what geosocial data is and how that impacts you.
Thanks, Keenan. And thank you, Tyler, for the awesome introduction. I'm gonna give you guys a little background on Spatial, and then we're gonna move into, Keenan's gonna show you a couple of use cases for how this works out in SiteZeus. Okay, so Spatial is a 3-year-old company. We're based out of Cincinnati, and we specialize in social media segmentation. And we came from really a question and an insight. Why is it with all these billions of conversations people are having on social media about their mindsets, attitudes, and interests, why is it so difficult to understand a location and relate all those interests back to our brand and our brand success? And really what this answers for retail site selection is, why do I have sites that perfectly match demographic criteria yet still fail? There's something else going on here. Okay, so how does this work? So Spatial takes all the information that people are journaling on social media about their mindsets and interests through partnerships with Facebook, Instagram, and a couple other social media companies. These are all text-based conversations that people are having. We ingest this data, and obviously it's really messy data. We use a machine learning and clustering algorithm to mathematically correlate like terms. And we use that to categorize really clean and usable segments. Okay, so let's do an example of this. So here is a cluster that the machine categorized. It names it E28, but here are some of the topics that make it up: intramural, softball, sports clothing, coaches, game day, varsity, youth sports. Okay, Keenan, if you were to see this, what do you think the machine is categorizing here?
It's got to be something to do with sports.
Yeah, so this is really obviously, this is a sports segment. We'll do a few more of these. So we got literature, authors. We have some emojis over here of books, novels, poetry. This is obviously a literary passion. These are people talking about books here in this segment. We'll do one more. I'll test you, Keenan, here. Style blogger, clothing brands, jeans emoji, cosmetics, accessories. What would you think?
It's got to be in the fashion category.
Yeah, so this is the fashion category. These are people that are really interested in fashion and they're sharing it. So as you can see, once you categorize these and you quantify them over location, for the first time you can quantify and relate back some of these conversations and what that means for your brand and your brand success. And what shows up is a really highly dimensionalized view of these communities that we've never been able to have before. So for each one of these categories, there's a list of topics that make up the category. So there's 15 topics here, but there's hundreds and hundreds that make these up. And for each category, it has demographic correlations. So communities that are really high in talking about books have a younger population, higher earning potential, lower or higher on home ownership. You can see these demographic correlations to give you a better understanding of that category. And what I think is really cool about SiteZeus and Spatial together is SiteZeus has such a powerful machine learning capability that we can throw 90 of these segments at it, and you can immediately see how does that relate to my brand. So you can probably look at some of these segments here, segments from millennials to hipsters to people that are seeking deals. You can probably see which one of these gut feeling relates to your brand. What I think is really cool is when you can see which one of these categories actually has a negative impact on my brand. And that can really help you skip locations that would have been a bomb. Okay, we're gonna switch gears here for a second. We're gonna put up a poll. How many of you have used psychographics in the past? We're gonna launch that poll and let it run. So I think it's really helpful to see GeoSocial data in relation to the rest of the data market. We can see a couple of responses coming up. It looks like about almost 50-50 here. A lot of people using it, a lot of people not using psychographics. Sounds like a lot of people are familiar with it. So a good way to understand our data is if you look at it in a matrix. From functional behavioral, so functional is basically, this is just stats and data on people, usually relates to a number. All the way to the top, which is behavioral, these are mindsets and attitudes. And then left to right, where people live to where people go. So the left to right quadrant has had a really big shift in the past couple of years of technology that I will get to later. So obviously where people live and functional insights, you have your demographics. These are tried and true and will always be really important. Somewhere around the 90s, we realized the necessity to understand the mindsets and attitudes of communities. But there's a really big problem in that we don't have data or surveys that can extrapolate across all of the block groups in the United States. So how do you get this information? Well, in the 90s, we did the best that we could, and we created Simmons survey, which is most psychographics are built off of surveys. And what we did is we took the psychographic survey and then applied them to demographics. So if you make $100,000, you're probably going to answer very, very similar to other people that make $100,000. And what this did is it gave us kind of additional flavor to understand some of these communities. So we have psychographic, you're probably familiar with these, Claritas Prism, Personics. And then moving on to the horizontal axis. This is really interesting. So with the invention of the iPhone and then all the data that are coming off of that, we actually now have data in areas that we never did before. And that's why we've seen mobile data really rise to the front, site selection, in the past couple of years. But there's a gap here, right? So how can we understand behaviorally how people are actually behaving in communities? Not surveys that are extrapolated. How can we actually understand that? And that's where spatial fits in. It is behavioral in that it is mindsets and attitudes of people, but it's also built bottom up. Every block group has all these conversations that we're categorizing and quantifying. I like to use an anecdote when talking about this. So with mobile data, we had a rule of thumb in the past, 1, 3, 5 mile rings were basically your trade areas. Now we actually have the data to say, you know, trade areas might look very different than that 1, 3, 5 mile ring. You might have a natural, like a mountain or a highway that changes that up. It might look very different. We actually have the data to say that now that we're using this mobile data. Similarly, you can look to the left here and see this is a zip code psychographic segment that shows up high for the zip code. In the past, just because all the people fell into a specific income bracket here, we've labeled them as a specific psychographic segment, where now we have the actual data with people posting on social media and all these blog groups that we can look at the same exact area in Tampa and see very, very strong differences in how these communities act and behave. And all these differences can have an impact on your brand. So just to recap that, pre-iPhone era, the method was survey and extrapolation. The philosophy here was top down. And then post-iPhone era, the method was billions of observations. We've moved into active observations to passive observations. And we can build this bottom up. So the 3 key takeaways here are there are 8 billion conversations that people are having where they're journaling about their interests. And these conversations could be having an impact on your brand. This data set is built bottom up using actual conversations, not extrapolation of a sample size of surveys. And then 3, there's 90 plus behavioral segments that can all be activated and related to your brand with SiteZeus. And we're going to have Keenan take you through that.
Awesome. Really appreciate the introduction there, Leiden. So for all of us on the webinar, I now want to take what Leiden talked about in that GeoSocial data, and I want to show everybody that data live in our platform. And so before we do that, a few key things I want everyone to focus on as I'm going through this. Number 1, how does the GeoSocial data impact our predictive models? And so what you're going to see as I walk through the platform today is a level of transparency that we're able to provide the end user in how often and the impact that these type of data sets and variables are having and how they can explain the performance across your brand. The second component is it's not just about real estate. So site selection, market planning, portfolio optimization. As Leiden touched on, this type of data is based off of organic human behavior. And you saw the sample size, 30 million users, 8 billion conversations. It's giving us an opportunity to provide a quantifiable measurement that explains how communities behave differently, right? And not just communities, but sites. And so if you're on the webinar today and you're a marketing resource or you have the ear to a marketing team, this is really, really excellent information that now you can get access to visualize, report on, and make some intelligent decisions around who your customer is. So the use case that I want to take a look at is I actually want to run a poll to take a poll of everyone here in the audience to understand, if in previous life or currently, you've had multiple locations that on paper look very similar. So if you were to take a look at the historical process where you look at a 135 mile and they look almost identical or very similar, yet they perform starkly different. So I'm going to let that run for a few more seconds here. And so not surprised here, I'm going to go ahead and share the results. 100% of you replied that you have had this. And that's excellent because that's exactly what we want to focus on in the actual demo today. So this is where we take two sites that are seemingly identical on paper looking at it from a functional data standpoint, right? So your household income, your ethnicities, your age, etc. But when we start to look at it from a behavior standpoint, we actually find that they behave quite differently. And so that's exactly what I'm going to walk through in the actual demo today. So I'm going to go ahead and switch my screens here. All right, so the demo I have today is a 300-unit sandwich shop that I've built. And as a reminder of how SiteZeus works, so the data that I brought into SiteZeus was my store-level proprietary data. In this case, I just did total sales in the site characteristics or attributes. So things like square footage, how many parking spaces do I have, number of seats, etc. The first thing I want to touch on before we get into any of the data is the Synergy Power Score over here on the left side of my screen and what that means. So I touched on transparency a little bit earlier. So with SiteZeus, we're able to build and deploy a predictive model in a matter of minutes. And to give you context, this model took less than 2 minutes to actually build and deploy. The end result of that is a score. And that score in this case is 87%. And it goes through a process called cross-validation, taking all of your proprietary data, combines it with the Olympus Data Exchange, including the Spatial AI data now, to come up with an end score, letting us know how predictive and how much validity or confidence can we put behind the outputs that we're about to interact with. The next component is general variable usage. So this is where SiteZeus is able to now allow the end user an understanding of which variables and how many are getting picked up and used across my portfolio to explain why my stores are performing the way that they are. So all of these data points are color-coded and they also have different icons. So you see all these blue ones up here. Those happen to be user-created site attributes. Then we get into some different demographics and ethnicities. Then we get into these purple ones. So local flavor, celebratory, masculine hair care. These are all spatial AI taxonomies that Leiden was touching on earlier. So it goes all the way down, a proud homeowner, urban fashion, community fun. And so we're going to touch on these a little bit later. So now let's go ahead and jump down into a market here. And since SiteZeus is based in Tampa, let's go ahead and keep it local here to Central Florida. And I want to focus on a couple sites. So I've got a site here in Wesley Chapel. It's an existing store. I'm going to go ahead and click on that. You can see it happens to perform 25% below my brand average. And then I have another site over here just west of Orlando in Winter Garden that performs 24% higher than my brand average, 790,000. So let's go ahead and jump into the synergy grid here before we take a look at these sites on paper. I want to let Leiden talk a little bit about the spatial data as we look at it inside of SiteZeus before we start to visualize and report on it. So I'm jumping into what we call our synergy grid here in SiteZeus. And this is really a dashboard that allows a user insight into any individual or category of data. So I'm going to go ahead and hover over blue collar here and let Leiden just articulate and reiterate a little bit of about what he touched on earlier.
Yeah, so on the left-hand side, you can see the different categories. When you hover over this extra information here, you can see the description. So I'll just read this. Low maintenance interests that are often associated with more industrial lifestyle. And then topics of conversation. So these people are talking about sports, motorsports, Pilsners, NASCAR. So this is essentially like blue collar type free time. So there's the information over here. You can hover over any one of these and see that. Now, if you move over this way, you can see the scores here. So what I'll point you to is our scores are -10 to +10. -10 means this type of behavior essentially does not exist here. +10 means that nationally, this is the highest for this type of behavior. 0 is average. So I'm going to just circle this for the average site here. 2 means that's actually a little bit above average for blue collar behavior nationally.
Excellent. Thanks, Lydon. And so what we're going to now do is actually jump back to the map, and we're going to take this full circle. So we'll actually be able to start to visualize some of these data points on the map and start to make sense of them. But before we do that, I want to jump to a report on these two locations. So this is a report I built earlier. On the left-hand side, on the left column, we have our high performer. It's doing 790,000. It's 24% higher than my brand average. And on the right column, we have our underperformer, doing 25% below average. And the point I want to highlight here is, just like I talked about on the use case of those slides, is we've got two sites that on paper, looking at it from a historical process perspective, they're almost identical. Average age, median age, identical. Education, very similar, if not identical. Same for ethnicity and the population breakdown, very similar. Home value, we do see a slight tweak or a slight difference. But then when we come down to incomes, again, very similar, if not identical. Then we get into our labor force, almost identical. And then looking at population, again, very, very similar. So if we were to just look at it from a pure demographic standpoint, they look very similar, but we already know they perform starkly different. So now let's jump down to the behavior of these two sites and look at these top 10 spatial segments that showed up across our general variable usage. So anything ranging from activist millennial all the way down to urban fashion. And the two that I want the audience to really focus on here that Lydon's going to help interpret for you is the blue collar and the urban fashion segment. So Lydon, maybe help the audience understand how to interpret the behavior of these two sites.
Yeah. Okay, this is interesting. So I'm looking at the overperformer here on the left-hand side. You can see blue collar here is 5. So that is 0 is average. 5 is very high for blue collar. And so in the case for this brand, high blue collar is very good for this brand. And then you see the one that is also, so negative, urban fashion, it's at the bottom, it's -4. So urban fashion is bad for this brand. So it looks like this brand resonates more with people that are looking for deals, whereas maybe urban fashion, these are people that talk about brands. They're interested in maybe more expensive things. Probably doesn't resonate with them. They may have a higher palette. So if you look on the right side here, that's the underperformer. It has a -1 for blue collar. That is not good for this sandwich shop. And then it has a high index of urban fashion. Remember, this brand actually resonates with people that are more deal seekers. And I think this is just one of those circumstances where the demographics look very, very similar, but you can see there's a big difference in the type of mindsets and attitudes in these communities.
Excellent. So let's go ahead and start to visualize that on the map now. So I'm going to go ahead and zoom into our underperforming site, where we're actually going to be able to highlight where and how this brand resonates with the blue collar and urban fashion segment. So I'm going to jump over to our heat map here. And I'm just going to type in blue collar. And again, you can heat map any taxonomy or any data point here in SiteZeus. And so remember, blue collar resonates well with this sandwich shop brand. But notice when we heat map this, we're getting a below average, -4 and 0, or right at average, and -4 here of the blue collar. So in the immediate area here, we're having a lower than average engagement of these type of conversations and behavior. Although we do see some blue pockets here if we were to hover over where we're getting some strong scores or indexes. So Lydon, maybe just interpret this for the audience.
Yeah, so it looks like they located this place in where people with their mindsets are not exactly blue collar, so it's negative there, which might have to do with the lower performing store. I think what I would maybe recommend to this brand is you have some of the people that resonate with you just within arm's reach of your store. So for this particular location, I might recommend run a geolocated campaign directly towards the places that we can see statistically match your brand.
Fantastic. So let's also take a look at urban fashion here. I'm gonna go ahead and search urban fashion. Let's go ahead and run that heat map. And remember, we don't want to see a high score of urban fashion. That does not resonate well with this sandwich shop. So again, we're seeing an above average score here in the immediate area, a +5 for urban fashion. Also notice over here to the right, we're seeing where this blue area was showing for blue collar, we're seeing the complete inverse of that for the urban fashion. So to Leiden's point, you as a marketing team or resource, you can now, even for an existing site, start to leverage this type of data to create targeted campaigns or approaches to reach those people that are active consumers that ultimately do resonate with your brand. So let's go ahead and take a look at our Orlando site as well. And remember, our Orlando site is our high performer. It's doing 790,000, which happens to be 24% higher than average. All right, so let's go ahead and start out with blue collar here. All right, so again, I want to point out the legend of our heat map. That's down here on the bottom right. I want you to notice that we're seeing blue here, where we're getting a high positive score of an 8. And then even though we're not seeing blue right around the site, it's still a positive, right? So it's all relative.
3's pretty high.
Yeah, so 3's above 0. It's an above average. That's what we wanted to see here on the site, was an above average score. That's why it's performing high. And then we can see in some of these areas to the north, we're getting really high scores of blue collar. If we look at the inverse of that, so our urban fashion, so we're seeing green here, but it's a -2. So this legend over here on the right, it's dynamic. Even though we see a blue area up here in the top right, that's only because the highest score that we're seeing on the screen is a 1, which is just slightly above average. Again, which that's good for this sandwich shop. We do not want to see a high score of urban fashion. That does not resonate with the type of behavior that we want to see across this brand. So we can start to see all around this trade area, we've got some pretty negative scores, which again, that's exactly what we want to see for the sandwich shop brand. What I want to do is I want to zoom out here and I want to bring a couple other locations into the view here so we can start to take a look at this. So notice if I come down here to the right, I have another underperforming store and I'm still on urban fashion, and we can see we've got a score of an 8 there, Leiden. So
yeah, it's not good for that brand.
It's not. We've got a really, really high score there that's letting us know there's a lot of engagement behavior right around that site that's talking about urban fashion. Another interesting insight here is let's move up to a mediocre average site. It's doing just below our average, or basically right at average. To the north, we've got a positive urban fashion score, even some pockets where we're getting upwards of 8s, right? But you can see there's a fine delineation here that's actually depicted by a major highway. So I think what we're seeing here is there's kind of an artificial boundary or trade area that's been created by a major road network, which I know a lot of you out there have typically a gut intuition about that. Look how this is actually dividing the behavior of a community, where to the south, we have what we want to see for this sandwich shop, where we don't want to see a high urban fashion score, but to the north, we do have a high urban fashion. So this site seems to be right on the fence of that trade area that roadway is created. So I know that was a lot to take in. I want to go ahead and jump back to our deck here and make sure that we touch on a few of the key takeaways. All right, so there's really 5 key takeaways that we want to focus on. Number 1, Leiden did a fantastic job of overviewing what does the data landscape look like today. So you have functional and behavioral, and then you have pre-iPhone and post-iPhone. And so where does all of that fit in, and where does GeoSocial fit in, and how is it impactful to you as an end user? Secondly, is the difference between psychographics and GeoSocial data and why that matters. So the short of it is you take psychographics that are built from a top-down approach using a 25,000 person survey versus a bottom-up approach that's based off of organic human behavior, 30 million users, 8 billion data points, that finally allows us to create quantifiable differences to explain how communities behave differently. Then the use case that we looked at, where 100% of you answered, you have existing sites that on paper look similar, if not identical, yet they perform starkly different. And so we were able to highlight today in the webinar how you can start to explain those differences by cutting right to the chase of not just from a demographic or psychographic of what these people look like, but how and why they behave the way that they do. Number 4 is how geosocial data can impact your site selection process. So it's not just about looking at existing stores. You can take that same approach and that same method that we looked at in SiteZeus today and apply that to future locations or infill opportunities or greenfield or white space analysis, because you're going to see the nuances and the differences in this data store by store, community by community. And you've never been able to do that before leveraging this type of behavioral data. And then lastly, hopefully there's some marketing resources on the call today, or if not, some of you are going to go back to your marketing team and plant the seed, but you can start to see how you can understand who your active consumers are, where they're being active, what they're talking about, and how they're behaving in and around your trade areas to create a much more efficient targeted campaign to drive more business to your locations. So I know we've covered a lot today. We're going to have a QA session, but first, Tyler threw out a little bit of a teaser there at the introduction. And so what we want to offer for anybody that's still on the webinar today is what we call a proof of concept. And we're really fortunate to be able to do this in conjunction with Spatial. And so there's really 3 simple steps in order to do that. And we're able to do this because SiteZeus can build and deploy predictive models in a matter of minutes. And so the first is reach out to us, sales@sitezeus.com, or give us a call. And what we're going to do is execute a mutual non-disclosure agreement. Once that's done, we'll send over a data sheet to collect your proprietary data, so store, lot, long, or address, your revenue or performance data, any site characteristics or attributes that you have, and then we're able to build and deploy that model for you within 48 hours. And that includes the spatial data. So if you're interested in seeing your stores with a predictive model, leveraging spatial AI data turned on instead of seeing a sample demo, then please reach out to us, because we can turn that around in under 48 hours. So I know we've covered a lot today. Hopefully some of you have been putting some questions into the chat box here throughout the webinar. So Lyden and I are going to hang on the line here for the next few minutes to answer any questions that have come up. So it looks like our team's passed along a few questions here, and let's go ahead and just jump right in, Lyden. So maybe reiterate to the audience here, how is this type of data captured?
Yeah, it's a good question. So social media companies have open APIs, and they also have partnership capabilities. So for example, we have a partnership with Twitter where they're sending us text conversations happening over location every day. So it's constantly coming in, and we're pulling the text data and the conversations and categorizing them. Excellent.
So next question. What social media platforms are being tracked? And I know you touched on that a little bit earlier, but maybe just reiterate that for the audience.
Sure. Yeah, so Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Flickr, we use event data. Just think of anything where people are talking or expressing their interests, we're pulling that information and we're categorizing it.
And that's across, correct me if I'm wrong here, Lyden, 30 million users and about 8 billion conversations?
That's right. And as Tyler said in the beginning, every 11 seconds, somebody signs on to social media, so it's growing every day.
That's fantastic. All right, so next question we've got here. Let's see, what's in the foundation of traditional psychographics? And does that include social data at all?
Yeah, not that we know of. I don't think there's any social data in psychographics. And at the foundation, so there's essentially a survey that comes out 25,000 a quarter, and those are reapplied to demographics. And that survey may include things like what type of things or what type of brands you resonate with, what kind of car do you drive. And so that's why you see, if 2 people have, maybe a very high income, they're likely to drive things like an Audi, a Benz, things like that. And so that's how you'll see those psychographic segments developed.
Excellent. All right, so this looks like this last question might be more for me. So can this help an emerging brand? And Leiden, feel free to jump in here as well. The short answer is absolutely yes. So I know today we focused on how can it impact a predictive model and some other ways to look at it, but absolutely can help an emerging brand. Even if you don't have enough stores or enough data to start to build a predictive model, looking at spatial data can start to still help you identify who your active consumers are, where they're having these type of engagements, and maybe even how that differs. Even if you have a small sample set of 4 or 5 or 10 or 15 stores, these stores are in communities that are going to behave differently. So again, even if they're the same on paper, like we looked at earlier from a pure functional data demographic standpoint, they might be different in how they're behaving. And so you're going to start to get some insight into what segments or what taxonomies are creating an impact at each one of the stores, and see that on an individual store level. So it looks like that's it for the questions coming in. If there are any questions that have come in that we haven't answered, we're going to certainly loop back to those here after the call, or feel free to reach out to us. We really appreciate everybody taking the time out of their Tuesday to come in and learn more about the GeoSocial data. We could not be more excited to start 2019 off with a partnership with Spatial AI, and want to thank Leiden for flying down to Tampa to co-host this webinar here in the office today. So I hope everybody has a fantastic 2019 and a great rest of the week.